Field by field, Maizex is bringing Canadian seed to farmers across Canada. Maizex is your source for high-performance soybeans and grain, silage, and grazing corn hybrids. Visit maizex.com to find your local Maizex representative.
The Agronomist is made possible by the Corn School, RealAg on the Weekend, and Wheat Pete's Word. Each Wednesday, Peter Wheat Pete Johnson answers your top agronomy questions in this dynamic podcast, covering soil health, cover crops, planting, herbicides, and so much more. Have a question? Leave him a message at 888-746-3311, send him a tweet at WheatPete, or email him at pjohnson@realagriculture.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and there's a lot going on for this episode, let me tell you, which, of course, you'll find out in just a moment why we're maybe a few minutes late. Sorry about that, everybody, but glad you enjoyed our intro music, and wonderful to see everybody watching us live. Lots of comments already, and good to see John. I see John is back. It's been a while. Okay, just a quick reminder, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Let us know you took in the episode and we'll get you all signed up for those. And tonight we are talking pollination problems. This is going to be very informative for all of you who don't know how pollination works. So there you go. Let's bring in our guests, experts on pollination, because we're all parents here. We've got Steph Berlett, and we were supposed to have Doug Moisey, but you'll notice he looks a little different. Doug having some technical issues. So I yanked in a favor. Peter Wheat Johnson of Real Agriculture joining us. Hi, Pete, again today.
Hey, Lyndsey. You're late. I just got to say, you're late.
I tried. I really did try. Yeah, I know. But a few technical issues, but we can work on it. And yes, Steph found a box to stand on so she could make it all the way up to the camera, just like I have. Thank you, Warren. Steph, how are you?
Well, Warren's not one to throw stones. Let's just point that out.
Glass houses and all of that.
Yeah. Nobody on this call is really one to throw stones from that perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's right. We didn't have anyone from the League of Extraordinarily Tall Gentlemen on, but we should one of these days. Okay, so let's start with, and if anybody I think John caught the radio show today, so he's maybe sick of the Lyndsey and Peter show, but here you go, another whole hour. But let's start with where we're at in the growing season and the area. Steph, I'll start with you. Around here in the East, it is just wet, wet, wet. I did have a chance in this last week to tour a bit of Ontario. There is some pretty sad fields out there. Overall, though, how are things looking around where you are?
Yeah, so we chatted a little bit earlier. Huron County, I don't want to say it. Things look pretty good here. We're quite blessed. Sorry, to the south and to the east and the north and the west. But no, we're actually quite things look good here. Now, you don't have to go far to find some tougher looking fields, that's for sure. Even just across the border into Perth County, there's definitely some wet feet and some scars from that lingering for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we do apologize for everyone watching from Western Canada who needs the moisture. If I could share it, I would. But there's plenty that are hard at harvest, so they wouldn't want the rain now anyway. Pete, we talked earlier today. You did not get the remnants of Hurricane Debbie, but some did. So how do things look where you farm?
Yeah, things are very borderline. How's that? Extremely borderline. And it just when you drive around, if I drive to the south, things are ugly. I've walked edible beans in 20-inch rows that have nowhere close to canopied, and they are full of root rot. I have a grower who didn't get his fungicide applied, and now the black beans are right full of anthracnose. We have extremely variable corn. When you talk about pollination, that late corn, the stuff that really got beat up by rain, I'm not even sure if it's going to have a cob, or if it does have a cob, how many kernels that cob is going to have. So there's some very tough crops. And yet, when I go north, because I do scout kind of up in Steph's area and even further north, and I talk to some people, man, there are growers in Ontario who just think it's about as perfect as it could be. The one, Donald at Udney, sent me a voicemail message actually. His corn, 34,000 plants per acre, 18 rows, 45 long. And that's up at Uxbridge. So that's super short season area. To have that kind of corn crop up there, you just go, like I'm drooling. I'm 100% drooling. So extremely variable in my part of the world.
Okay. We, again, we have some crops that look quite good here in the East. I mean, really, I can't complain overall, but certainly still some wheat fields that haven't got harvested, that the rain has put them off again and again, which is frustrating. And now after that just absolute downpour we had, which is not, this is like the third, fourth, fifth downpour that we've had. Definitely some lakes where they should not be. I was telling Steph just before we went live that there are some ducks that have taken up residence in what should be fields and just have decided this is a pond now. And maybe it is for the rest of the year. So we'll hope certainly that the soybeans maybe are thankful for this rain as they're filling, and we'll see. And that's, of course, which brings us to part of our discussion tonight. Now, Doug may join us a little later if we can get him reconnected and see where we're going with that. We'll maybe talk a bit more about heat blast. But I do want to talk a bit about, what can go wrong at pollination, what all has to line up for it to go right. Steph, I'll start with you. And when Doug hops on, we will talk canola for sure. Let's focus now on corn. Certainly, every year it seems we have this discussion about when the tassels come out, when the silks come out. Timing wise, how important is that? And is it really a big issue if we have a big window between those two?
Man, I feel like I wasn't prepared to give a birds and a bees talk tonight.
You're gonna.
And one corn plant loves another corn plant.
That's right.
So, yeah, I mean, when we look at the anatomy of those corn plants, right, and we have those tassels, the male bodies, and we want to hit those silks, the female bodies, there's lots of times when we do a lot of tassel fungicide in our geography because of the amount of livestock in the area. So we're really trying to hit that vomitoxin window, and we'll get lots of calls saying, oh, the tassels are out. And you're like, no, we need to line this up. We're targeting those silks. So not necessarily, those tassels are one indicator of that pollination starting, but we also are looking for those silks and lining that window up. Because it seems even when we get under certain stresses, we can have those silks come out and the tassels haven't even come out yet. We were fortunate this year in our geography. We had great conditions, but I know talking to some of our other colleagues at some different agromarts down in London, like Pete said, more south of the 401, and talking to them about fungicide spraying, and they said, man, there's silks out that are waiting for the tassels, and it's just so variable right now because there's corn plants up to their waist and there's corn plants up over their head. So that variability game, I don't know. I don't know that 100% fungicide efficacy is on the table at that point. That window, you give it some days grace, but there's a certain point where, you write it off that you're going for plant health at that point.
So really interesting observations, if I can, Lyndsey.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
I'm an old guy, right? And if you go back when Terry Daynard, you don't have to nod in agreement with that, Lyndsey. You really don't. Okay, I just want to say it's okay. You could go, oh no, you're not, Pete.
I cannot tell a lie. All right, carrying on.
Terry Daynard, when he was doing his, I believe either his master's or his doctorate, that's back in the 70s. And back then, they had this tassel silk index that they talked about a lot. And when Steph talks about the silks emerging first, that's actually a really good thing. That means that the corn plant is super happy. Back when we didn't have the stress tolerance that we have today, the tassel would come out first. And the amount of time between when the tassel emerged and the silk emerged would tell you or predict, was a great predictor of what your final yield would be. The greater the difference between tassel emergence and silk emergence, the lower the yield was going to be. And the tassels came first and would start to shed pollen. The silk wasn't there. And if the silk didn't manage to emerge before the tassels were done shedding pollen, you were in all bad shape. Last year, almost ubiquitously, the silks emerged 4 to 5 days prior to the tassels. It was really consistent. What it did was open up the fungicide window, but we had awesome corn crops pretty much across the province last year. This year, it's been really interesting. I was talking with Greg Stewart about this because we were expecting silks first, and the silks didn't show up. In many fields, it was a tie. The silks emerged when the tassels emerged, and that's still okay. But in some of these stressed fields that Steph is talking about, man, the tassels are coming out, the silks aren't there yet, and those fields are absolutely in trouble. And it tends to be those really stressed areas of the field. And as I said, there may be no cob there whatsoever, or a cob with 5 kernels on it. And as Steph said, the good corn that tasseled and pollinated 3 weeks ago, it's going to be at 24% moisture, hopefully, when we harvest it. Those late pollinated ones, man, they could still be at 45%. It's just going to make harvest a tremendous challenge.
Okay, so in that is a good point. Steph, if we're looking at, as we approach that harvest window, how do we handle a field that has potentially that much variability? Who's got a dryer? Yeah.
Sorry. Say that again.
How are we going to handle that kind of variability potentially in some of those really nasty ones?
Yeah, it's that's a toughie. I mean, you've had whole episodes on vomitoxin, and we don't have time to get into that tonight, but we saw that in that, when was that really bad year, 2018, 2019? And the variability in that testing procedure, those tests have the potential to be all over the map if it does show up this year in the corn crop when you have that much variability. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So, and Warren hops in here also saying that the crops look good where he is. And yes, I would attest. Really going to have to monitor grain bins this winter with corn from those areas. Pete, why would we have to be more cautious with corn going into the bin potentially from some of these fields?
Well, when you run the corn through the dryer, if it's all between 28 and 32% or whatever, if it's within a 4-point range and you dry it to 15 or 14%, it will all be storable. And then as moisture migrates, it will be in good condition. When we get these kernels that are really high in moisture, and they tend to migrate, so we'll get areas in the bin. Typically, those are going to be lighter kernels. They're going to have more fines. They're probably going to end up in the center of the bin. So coring the bin is going to be super important from that perspective. But you can well imagine, Lyndsey, that if I put a corn kernel in the dryer at 25%, and right beside it I put a corn kernel in the dryer at 40%, that when they exit the dryer, because they're in the dryer the same amount of time, the one at 25% will be at 13%, and the one at 40% will still be at 18%, and corn doesn't keep at 18%. So now if I get a bunch of those 18% kernels all together in the bin, I've got big, massive problems. So Warren's 100% right. Watch the bins. The other, I mean, as a grower who delivers to a commercial elevator, when I take my first load in and they say, way to go, Pete, it's 25%, carry on. And I take the next load in and they say, whoa, Pete, this is 34%. It's all going to depend on what kernels they got in the tester from that particular sample. And so we're liable to see big swings in moisture at harvest, and almost for sure we're going to have to over dry that corn, because those 40% kernels that end up at 18%, we're going to need some 12% kernels. So as the moisture migration happens between those kernels, they even out and they're still end up at 15% or something in that range, so we don't have problems in the bin.
So that we're not making liquor in our bins. Okay. These are important things to know. All right. Now, Steph, to back this up a little bit, we know that weather, moisture, tassel timing, all these things play into what will eventually be, either ideal pollination or perhaps a bit of a struggle, etc. What can we do potentially as growers to set up a crop as best as possible for success for that critical period?
Yeah, that's a good point, because you've split out those categories: the controllable factors and Mother Nature, and the uncontrollable, sorry, and then what we can control. I always tell my customers, farming's an outdoor sport, so we have to focus on what we can control. And the biggest thing we're trying to do off the hop is adequate fertility, taking away those other stresses. If we're seeing potash deficiency and nitrogen deficiency heading into that, it's one more compounding stress on top of what Mother Nature's already doling out to that corn crop. It's painful. So, the biggest, first, most check block we try to look after is adequate fertility on those, on any of those crops, just to take any of those other stresses away, for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Pete, do you have magic pixie dust that you can sprinkle across a field that's struggling?
That is the number one question that we get, is what can we do? And the answer is, if Mother Nature plays the joker, you are out of luck. And so growers will say, is there a foliar fertilizer can I spray on it? What about some fancy seaweed kind of goop?
Yes.
That's a stress reliever, let's fix it. Well, I mean, I'm sure at this point that there are some things out there, stress relievers, but we simply haven't got them figured out yet. And I hope that they figure them out very quickly. At the end of the day, when there is no oxygen in the soil, you get zero root growth, you get denitrification of nitrogen. Right now, in a lot of cornfields, in the wetter areas that I'm walking, in the compacted areas, it's really interesting. In the compacted headlands, we are starting to see tremendous nitrogen deficiency. In the field in general, even though it might be a low area in the field, and you would say, well, there was just as much water ponded there, but because it's not compacted, it drained away better. We're not seeing the nitrogen deficiency where we don't have that compaction, but the compacted headlands are just getting beat up. So if there's anything a grower can do, it's to make sure that their soil is in as good a shape as possible. Tile drainage. And, full disclosure, I work with those guys. I'm the environmental advocate for the Land Improvement Contractors of Ontario. But regardless, if you have that soil so it can absorb some moisture, the moisture can go in, it can move through the soil, it can get away in the tile, you're going to be in much better shape. So soil health, soil structure, soil tilth, lack of compaction, avoid compaction, and tile drainage helps with all those things. Beyond that, pixie dust, no. The pixie dust is a simple solution, Lyndsey. It's another $1,000 or $2,000 an acre for more tile.
Okay. Goodness. I think that's a fantastic answer. Okay, so one of the things, I'm going to go to producer Jay, if you would. We're going to go to a clip. This is a canola school clip with Nate Ort, talking about heat stress in canola, which slightly different, but he mentioned some work out of Ontario that talks about boron. So perhaps there isn't pixie dust, but maybe there is a nutrient that could help us. And then I see Woody's got a good question here. So producer Jay, if you would.
During heat stress conditions, like much of the prairies are seeing right now, including southern Manitoba where we are, and there's been quite a bit of research done on this by Drs. Malcolm Morrison, Rob Duncan, and Chad Kaselny, and most research indicates that around 30 degrees Celsius is when heat stress starts. So when this starts, the proteins and the lipids on both the pollen grain and the stigma change. And they no longer communicate, and the stigma no longer recognizes that this is pollen that has fallen down onto it. So the reproductive development then comes to a halt, and it stops. And so that is why we see seed yield reductions under heat stress.
So essentially it's a communication breakdown?
Exactly.
That's an interesting way to think about it. Is there anything genetic that we know in terms of improving that heat stress tolerance in canola?
Yeah, so those researchers that I just mentioned actually have shown that we can screen for heat stress tolerance. So this is something that life science companies and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada are likely doing anyways now, in light of the warm conditions that we have this year, but we've had hot summers before, and in the face of climate change too, this is definitely something on the forefront of everybody's mind.
There has been a fair bit of talk about boron treatment, I'd say over the last decade or so in Western Canada. There are also some other products out there that have marketing related to heat stress and alleviating the symptoms of it. What can you tell us about the research that's been done? Maybe let's start with the boron treatment and the impact that has on canola heat stress.
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of research done on foliar applied boron for heat stress in Ontario, and I believe that they have over 30 site years, but really what they found was only just over 30% of the time was there an economic response. Okay, and that's in Ontario, so take that for what it is. Fast forward a couple of years, and so this would have been a couple of years ago now, but the Canola Council did their own heat stress and boron trials, and we were unable to find a response. And so there's this, just over 30% response, economic response in Ontario, and no response here. But let's keep in mind, Ontario is a completely different growing environment than Manitoba.
Our sponsors tonight are Wheat Pete's Word, The Corn School, and RealAg on the Weekend. In partnership with Rocco Radio at Saskatoon, Real Agriculture is pleased to present RealAg on the Weekend with host Sean Haney. Listen live on Saturdays at 4 p.m. Saskatchewan time on 650 CKOM Saskatoon and 980 CJME Regina, or find it on Real Agriculture or RealAg's podcast feed. Check out cjme.com and ckom.com for a podcast download. I really like that Nate wants to lay it all out. Ontario is very different than Manitoba. Amen, brother. Okay, so Steph, what do we know about that work that was done here in Ontario? Should we be checking for boron, adding foliar boron? What work happened? What do we know?
I mean, canola certainly is its own kind of beast. Hungry for boron with all those flowers on there for sure. I don't, and Pete can correct me, I don't know that work's been done in corn yet, quite to that level. I know Mosaic, they have quite a bit of that data regarding more specifically just about pollen development and how that boron can influence those anthers and the entire cell wall development in the pollen. But the canola, for the whopping acres that are grown in Ontario, so take note, everybody in the West, huge. Boron's pretty well become standard key in most of our applications, both from a soil application as well as a foliar when fungicides are applied. In anything we can do to elongate that pollination window in the canola, we tend to see that ROI in small doses as well. I mean, we don't need huge amounts of boron, so that tends to help with that too.
Jason Vogt just wants to put in here that Nate is awesome, and yes, he is. But boron is not going to solve all of our problems necessarily. Pete, your thoughts on what we can do? Can boron save us in a tough year?
Yeah, and so
Boron
the answer,
save us.
Save us,
every
boron.
yeah, boron will not save us. And by the way, it's quite dependent on crop.
Yeah.
Many nutrients, micronutrients, secondary nutrients, are quite crop specific. So, for example, calcium in field crops, we kind of say, calcium, who cares? All of our Ontario soils have lots of calcium, even in Western Canada. Like, calcium is rarely an issue. Meanwhile, if I grow tomatoes or if I grow peanuts, if I don't have enough calcium with peanuts, they will not put any seed in the pod, and they get poppers in the ground, which is the term for an empty pod. They pick them and they pop. There's nothing in them. Boron is really quite important for the brassica species, so canola. If you don't have enough boron when you grow a rutabaga, which really is just another brassica, you get water core. So if you've ever cut open a rutabaga and the heart of it is hollow, that's water core. That's a boron deficiency. Alfalfa and the brassicas, they have higher demand for boron. Will boron save us at pollination because it's quite involved with pollen tube formation? Not a stinking chance. If you have deficiency and you make an application, then you should see response. In wheat, I have done, I don't know how many boron trials. I have yet to find any positive response whatsoever. So when Nate says 30, that's Brian Hall's work, by the way, here in Ontario. 30% of the trials showed economic response, and that typically wasn't necessarily a foliar. It could have been 2 pounds of boron applied in the fall as solubor. So lots of different things. But canola's, it's a brassica. It needs more boron. The other thing, though, Lyndsey, that I think is really cool that Nate talked about is the temperature at which we get this flower abortion in canola. It's true in oats. In fact, Tyler and Barry, just south of Brantford at Onondaga, they planted their oats on the frost this year in February. I forget the date, but they counted the number of florets on that oat crop, and I forget what it was, but it was just like, it was unheard of because the conditions were so perfect right up until flowering. And then the stupid oat crop headed out and tried to pollinate in that week in June when it went to 35 Celsius.
It was gross.
And they had at least 20% floret abortion in the oat crop. And so one of the most interesting things about pollination with any crop, it's true in corn, it's true in soybeans, it's true in oats, it's true in canola, is that the optimum temperature for growth is higher than the optimum temperature for pollination. So when we talk about corn and the optimum temperature for growth is kind of a 30 or 32 degrees Celsius day and a 24 degree night, like that's when corn, like you can hear it grow overnight. No, actually, when it pollinates, it would much rather have a 25-degree day and an 18-degree night. And so when you look at these growth curves, if you want the perfect year, you don't have excessive heat at pollination. And it's whether it's canola or it's wheat or it's any crop, cooler temperatures at pollination really do help increase the amount of seed set that you will get. I'm sure if Dr. Dave's listening, I'm sure he'll say, wait a minute, Pete, this crop, that doesn't hold true. There's always exceptions to the rule, but
Always.
for the most part, cooler temperatures, they help.
Okay. And we could talk about water as well. That rainfall can play a role as well. Laurent Van Arkel, who some of
That's
us know
Woody.
as Woody.
That's Woody.
Yes, I know. But I like that his name comes up as Laurent Van Arkel, a French name with Van Arkel. Whatever, we got this. Talking
a French
about
Dutchman. Lord help us.
Lord help us. But I bet the food's great. I'll be honest. Okay. What about mixing varieties to stagger pollination? So one of the other things, Steph, that I was going to ask you, and again, what we can control, what we can't, and Pete sort of hit on it as well, is talking about planting date, right? So I know certainly, and if we can get Doug lined up to join us, when Warren says, "Who is Laurent?" Yeah, does he have hair? He does not, Warren. I can vouch for that. So when we're talking about choosing, let's say, to frost seed something or going with, let's say, a fall seeded canola to try and avoid that window. And when we're talking in the West, we certainly want to go in early with our canola crop to try to avoid the worst of that hottest part of the summer. Again, we can't entirely guess when that will be, but we typically know average when the hottest part of the summer will be. So I guess that does bring up the question, could we be staggering or choosing different varieties or hybrids to potentially try and limit some pollination issues? Peter, you're smiling. I'll go to you first.
Sure. So this was a great idea that Greg Stewart had as well. It's kind of like let's lengthen out the window where we have pollen available for the corn crop to pollinate. And theoretically, it should work. And Greg was kind of thinking, well, we'll put in 20% of an earlier maturing variety and 20% of a later, or we'll vary that a certain amount. The problem is that now when I do that, I get back into this variable moisture in the kernels at harvest, plus sometimes the niches in terms of when pollen sheds and silk is present just miss entirely. If we get too big a spread, we get something under stress. And so in the trials that Greg did, where he looked at mixing varieties to spread out that amount of pollen or the window of pollen shed, he saw zero gain whatsoever. And there's just enough drawbacks that if there's no yield gain, then I think we're sort of out of the game, right?
Mm-hmm. So, Steph, would it work for if I wanted to do this, if I was worried about it, if I had silage, then it wouldn't matter? But then does it really matter?
Well, I just want to circle back, and Pete, you'd know more on this than I would. It's more of a southern practice, but I mean, this is what they do for seed production, right? Like we go in and plant the one line, and then we go in and plant the next line in order to make sure that pollination happens at the time that we want it to. Very isolated seed production. I mean, it's hard to do that on a full scale, field production side of things, but it's definitely something that we see on a silage side, not within each field per se, but we're definitely staggering based on, like you said, Lyndsey, for silage, different silage windows and things like that, and to mitigate some of that risk. That was one of the recommendations that came out of that first really bad vomit toxin year, but the most recent one, to spread out our hybrids to mitigate our risk as we have different flowering windows to prevent that infection from happening across just one hybrid through the whole flowering window. I think we've done this. Flipping back to canola for a sec, we've done this from a cultural practice by growing more winter canola, right? It's really taken off in the province, and we've seen that just because of that temporal advantage that it's not flowering most times during that hot part of the summer. It's getting that jump start in the spring ahead of the spring canola, and we're seeing that in the yield results of it.
Mm-hmm. Jason wants to share. This is one of the things I love about Manitoba, everybody. So Jason Vogt out of southern Manitoba seeded oats early, had the panicle emergence and flowering prior to the heat, which was huge. Like Pete said, we saw no heat blast in oats. First oats off did 176 bushels an acre at 43 pounds a bushel. Hot damn. That's what that is. That is a woo. Anyway, Warren doesn't believe it. He doesn't think that Manitoba can grow a crop that big. Just kidding. Oats just don't do that well here. Right, Warren? Okay, Kevin's got a good question. We touched on this very briefly at the beginning, but especially when it comes to corn, because we've got silks, tassel, and we've got that difference potentially in timing. Kevin, out on the west end of the country, how would you time fungicide with different maturities? So Pete, I'll go to you. This is, Steph mentioned it, we're targeting silks, not tassels, but how do you time that fungicide if you're dealing with variability?
So great question, Kevin. And corn is now a little bit like wheat. With wheat, when we first started with fusarium fungicides, it was day 2, hit day 2. That's the best. And by day 4, you're late. And so, that's the window. And be a day early is better than a day late. What we've learned is that actually we might see a little bit more visual fusarium if we're a day late, but the fungicide still has efficacy on the fungus. And so even though we might see a little bit more visual, we actually see less DON concentration in the grain if we're a day late. And Steph's mentioned it a number of times. We generally see the biggest DON concentration in the late stressed plants. If I have a field where I have, the odd plant in that field that emerged a little bit later, it's 2 days later or it's 5 days later, and it ends up being a little bit shorter and a little bit thinner stem, and it tassels a little bit later, man, it's under stress all the way through. And it seems like those under stress plants cannot fend off the gibberella as well as the plants that are not stressed. So we generally see the absolute most gibberella and the most DON accumulation from those later plants. So when we get these really big mixes, the answer to Kevin's question is hit as many green silks as you can, and you don't want to miss, don't wait for the last 10% if you're going to miss the first 90%. But if you can be at the tail end of that 90% window and catch as many of those 10% as possible, that's the big win. And it may not work, but it's certainly that's sort of the thought process that you go through. And then there's also this thing called, the practical reality. When's it going to rain? When is the helicopter or the plane available? When can I get through with ground application equipment without getting stuck this year? Steph doesn't have that problem. Down here we do. So there's so many factors that you put in there. But the thought process to me is a day late is better than a day early to a point.
Okay. All right. Let's hold our conversation there for a moment, because Pete, it sounds like we may have Doug. We're not 100% sure, because I've got some good questions for canola for Doug, but Pete, we're going to put you in the green room. So please don't run away, just in case. Okay. You are an excellent teammate, Pete. My hat goes off to you. Okay. So we'll bring in Doug Moisey with Corteva if we can. Producer Jay, if you would. Steph, while we're on it, so there he is. I've got some questions for Doug. That was instant. I thought that there was going to be like a switching of a microphone, maybe a hat. Doug, Can you hear us? There you are.
Yeah.
Look, we even got your name updated.
My apologies.
Oh, that's okay. We're good.
With work, and I got in late, and so all of a sudden they say, "Are you coming on?" I'm going, "Oh shit!" So.
But now you're here, so everything's fine. Okay, so Doug, to recap, we've basically only talked about corn, and then we talked about winter canola, and that canola is a boron hog. So I want to back up a little bit. You are in Alberta. Definitely have dealt with more than your share of heat this season. So catch us up. Can you tell so far how impactful that heat has been during that flowering window?
It depends. It really is. It's coming back down to is that data seeding played a big role this year. Some of the guys that actually got in prior to the rains that we had in that late May time period that shut everybody down, they got the first 10 to 12, maybe 15 days of flowering in there. Now, pod size is a little bit smaller, but not as many blanks on the main stem. Some of the later seeded guys, they got hit hard in some areas, especially because we had no subsoil moisture. And we've been living basically off of any rainfall we've been getting. And so some guys have been lucky enough to get the nice thunder showers at the right time. We also got some guys that didn't get it at the right time, and you can really see it in the crop. It's very thin. Main stem is completely burnt. There's maybe 3-4 pods on the main stem. That's where I was at this afternoon. I was at a field by Vermilion, and like some of the crop was looking really good, but some really got hurt badly where there's nothing on the main stem, but there's pods on the side branches because we had a respite there for about 4 or 5 days, and we had the smoke help us get through. But it's not the greatest outlook for some guys. There's no bumper crops out here, I don't think, not from what I've seen before. But they're going to be respectable. But normally guys that are producing 60 bushel canola this year, they're going to be hard pressed to get anywhere near that in some areas just because there was no subsurface moisture and there just hasn't been enough rain. But the heat really did kick the living snot out of the canola here this year.
So now, and you bring up an important point, and Steph, you touched on this earlier about, going to winter canola in Ontario as an option because it sort of moves it out of that window. Doug, you touched on sort of that early versus late. I know we talk a lot about, choosing your planting date or your seeding date for canola, about flea beetles, and we talk about, yield potential, but definitely heat blast is one of those concerns. So is the general rule of thumb to go early as possible to try and avoid it, or is it really depends on the year?
It depends on the year and how it plays out. I really, in my opinion, and this is mine, is that this year, the guys that had warm soils, it was the first week of May. The long range forecast was good weather all the way through for the first month of May, that they went hard and they went early and they were rewarded. Some of the guys that have their traditional dates that they start, you can see that they paid a little bit because although it came up very quickly because they were able to seed right after the rains hit, we had a very cold June. And if anything, it was a cold June that got us into this heat problem for the simple fact nothing was growing. Saw a lot of canola that wasn't moving, a lot of corn that never moved. It just sat there. And up in our area here, we had a frost on June the 20th of about 1.5 degrees and really burnt back some crops. So it's been a weird and wild year. And then there was just frost here the other night to the east of me. So
I saw that. Okay, but how bad of a frost and for how long? It didn't look
it's damaged the crops. It damaged it. There's been a few fields that were damaged, but if anything, it didn't really do much because the duration wasn't long and there was some humidity in the air because there was rainfall or cool, basically some good moisture. Now with us back into 27, 28 and no rain on the horizon for a while, I sure wouldn't want to frost now because it could really do some serious damage because seeds are now nicely filling. I looked at the field here last week that probably will start getting swathed this coming week just because it's moved along very quickly because of the heat. So, but no, and I think if we would have had a more normal June with maybe a few more rain showers and some warmer temperatures, we probably would have gone into flowering about 5 days earlier and would have probably alleviated that first little while. We could have actually covered ground. There's a lot of crops that flowered that I've seen that you can see down into the canopy. It's quite an open canopy.
Wow.
The leaf structure just didn't get that big. And so those are on the sort of that mid to later seeding. The early guys actually got good ground cover, but they were also lucky enough to catch you. It was basically canola coming out of the ground when it started to rain. So it really helped the crop this year. So
I think Steph is just thanking her lucky star. She doesn't live in Alberta.
A frost. I mean, now, mind you, we've had some fall nights in Ontario.
I would say,
it has felt like fall here.
Yeah, the nights have been definitely cooler, that's for sure. You're right, but nothing close to the single digits or less. No frost, thank goodness. Okay, just quickly, we're going to go to our last read of the night, and then we got a few more things we need to cover before we wrap up this episode. So, Producer Jay, if you would. The Agronomist is made possible by RealAg on the Weekend, Wheat Pete's Word, and the Corn School. Big corn yields demand intense management. From tillage strategies to nitrogen management, hybrid selection, pest management, and more, Real Agriculture's Corn School is a video series that tackles every facet of the corn growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Corn School is made possible by support from BASF and Pride Seeds. Learn more at cornschool.com. So now, Doug, before you hopped on, we did talk a little bit about what we can do or what's in our control and what's not, when we're thinking about, improving pollination. And boron, of course, is one of those questions. So we talked a bit about, how important it is to the plant, especially a big user like canola. But do you have any growers who are experimenting potentially with adding boron in season?
It's a real dicey situation because I was dealing with a situation earlier this year where the guys went on with a generic glufosinate, Liberty, mixed it with a liquid boron solution, and totally burnt the crop. Boron's probably one of our most toxic nutrients that we are dealing with in Western Canada. Typically, where we see boron deficiency is in sand soils. But we're also noticing is that when we have drier climates, it's not the fact that we're boron deficient, it's the fact that the plants just aren't extracting the root system just because it's so dry. So it's kind of dicey. Some guys are playing with it. There's a lot of different things that are being played with out in the marketplace. And, like this spring, we set up some trials to look at some growth hormone products, and we saw some differences here at flowering time as far as getting through the heat, etc. But it's early yet, and we're just trying to see where this is going. But my concern with boron is that we are not even reached our max potential for the amount of sulfur and nitrogen we need, and so I don't think boron's our limiting nutrient. I've been in some fields where we got sulfur deficiency because it's just not available because they're not putting it on to the rates that they should be, because everybody's concerned about putting product through the drill. And so guys are looking at different rates, different forms. And the problem is that when you have ammonium sulfate, it's very mobile in the soil profile. And if you've got something that's more of a sand soil, we find that like with 2 or 3 inches of rain, that sulfur can move down 10, 12 inches. And with no subsurface moisture, it's been touched. So I always encourage guys to test it and play with it. But right now, I think we've got bigger macros that we need to, basically bigger fish to fry before we start getting into the micro situation. And it's always been my concern. Like many years ago, I did play with a couple of boron products, and I was able to get a response one year, but I couldn't get it the next year. And this is just across the field. And so you kind of go, okay, what's going on? So in my mind, it's test it, try it. But I think we've got the bigger macronutrient situation that we need to work on better, and as far as I'm concerned. And then, but I'm not above anybody trying, but I just look at the money spent and I just going, okay, let's put some nitrogen and sulfur down first. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, you're nodding that, there's probably, let's get our macros right first before we worry about those micros.
Yeah.
Every single day. Yeah. It's, when you get into those micro questions, and like you said, Pete said, boron's not going to save you. But now the growers that have, those macros checked off, and we're looking for that next level, 100%, let's play. But and that circles back when you asked earlier, what can you do to mitigate all those other stresses during pollination? Have enough nitrogen down, have enough sulfur down, so that the plants are ready to go when pollination does happen. And if they are in those stressors, that they are ready to take it. To me, it's like starting a marathon hungry. Like you don't do that.
Yeah. That's a really good way to look at it.
Because I've run a lot of marathons, in case you were ever curious.
Well, yeah. I'll tell you that I watched it in the Olympics, and the winner did it in like 2 hours and 6 minutes, and that's ridiculous. So anyway, yeah, let's just. Anyway, okay. I do want to touch on, Doug, just quickly, and Steph, I'll ask you that not this year that we've dealt with smoke here in Ontario. Last year we certainly did, and have in the past. Doug, I've certainly heard where, perhaps smoke cover in hot weather might actually be a bit of a saving grace because it does act as shade. Certainly in Alberta, dealing with a lot of smoke this year. What is the overarching sort of sense of, does it help, does it hinder, or when does it do one or the other?
Well, this is my opinion, and from what I've read of a couple of research papers, the smoke actually puts the plants to sleep. That's what it's basically suspended animation. I think this year, especially on the early seeded canola that was flowering, I think the smoke, in my mind, protected because the sun wasn't as intense, even though it was hot. But that sunlight spectrum, like you get out here now, where there's got no smoke. Today it was 28 degrees, and I'm sorry, I don't cook well in that weather, and I was fried. And so there's canola that's flowering right now, and it's going through some intense heat in my mind. And I think the smoke takes a little bit off that. Yes, it's warm. Where I think we see the problem that comes in is it's the overnight temperatures. When we had an intense heat in Alberta, we didn't get below 20 degrees for many nights, and the canola just can't rest. But at least the smoke was able to kind of insulate the crop a little bit, and it minimized. It didn't stop the damage, but it minimized the amount that I think we were expecting to see. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Now,
well,
yeah, Pete mentions in the comments, because we can't keep him away, you guys. He saved the day today, and so he's going to stick around. But says that smoke haze saved the winter wheat crop in 2023 because it kept the heat away. Steph, would you agree as far as the impact last year was probably to the positive, or did the corn suffer? Did the soybean suffer because of the haze?
No, I think we were all anticipating that with the lack of solar radiation. And, we've attributed some big yields to some bonus solar radiation in past years. So I think we were all kind of holding our breath through August and September, going, what kind of crop are we going to be looking at? But we were actually, like Pete said, we had the corn crop looked great last year. So, I don't know whether factor in the same comments that Doug had, those overnight nights, and the crop just got a chance to breathe a little bit, or what. But definitely, I think it had, and I mean, we had a lesser impact than those
Right.
Western provinces. We kind of had that
Yeah.
outlier effect. It was still significant to us, but maybe
Yeah.
not as big of an impact on the crops as I think we were expecting. Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think last year for here in Ottawa anyway, and I know it reached down much further south. I mean, I think it was mostly June, and it was by far the most days in a row that I remember, really, since in my 10 years that I've been here, that we've had smoke cover. In Western Canada, though, it is unfortunately quite common, and perhaps more so. And so it does seem to have an impact, but maybe not necessarily overly negative on the crop anyway. Cities and towns notwithstanding.
Yeah. I'll point out though, there was about, I think it was 4 years ago when we had so much smoke in August. Daytime temperatures were only getting like 17, 18 degrees. The corn basically didn't move an inch until the sun came out in September. And, it was that cold and that smoky, like you could barely see the sun. It was almost like dusk for most of the day. So, it can help, but it can also hinder too. Because the corn got stuck at the stage, and when we got a frost, that's as far as it had gone. So,
right.
Yeah, we did have a warm September last year. That was, I forgot about that. That did save our hinds a little bit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was quite lovely. In general, sorry, Doug, but fall here in Ontario is quite beautiful. You should check it out sometime. And I wouldn't say it never frosts early here, touch wood, but not in August for the most part.
We did get
for the most part. Yeah,
we got pretty cool leading into wheat heading this year. Like there was definitely for the first time in a long time, I was getting questions on, and Pete, I'm sure Pete will have comments, but I was getting questions on, frost when the head was in the stem. This year we did get a little bit cool during that heading window. I was a bit nervous when those heads popped out to see if there's any damage.
Yeah. Well, although I do wonder, the crop was quite far advanced, right, as far as the calendar date, because we had such a mild and early start. That definitely interesting that it was cool. You're right with the when the crop was heading. So now, Doug, we did touch a bit on sort of that issue of heat blast and the impacts of it. Again, there's not a lot we can do during. When, though, would you typically say is, like how long do you give it before you would assess perhaps where you're at? You said you've been walking some fields that certainly have been impacted by it. Is a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? When would you suggest going out there and taking a look at what the impact might have been?
See the problem. Okay, so for me, it's about 3 weeks after the heat, because if you get into a really stressed situation with a little bit of moisture, and it's stressed out from the heat, the hormonal response actually will last a little bit longer than what we would want. It's just not like, okay, tomorrow's going to be 18 degrees and we've got rain. Well, right now the canola crops is going to boom. We're done. We're good. It's more like 6, 7 days later, we'll start coming out of it, and we'll come out of that stress mode, and then we'll start and the plant will start reassessing what's going on. And like what we're seeing now is in a few fields where the canola is reflowering, and it's trying to make up because the root system took notes saying, hey, I can support X amount of pods, and it didn't put enough on. Because the other thing that happens too is that you may get pollination, and I'm not talking about like a full long pod, but you might get 4 or 5 vacuoles formed to give you 4 or 5 seeds. But because the plant is so stressed out, the message that the pod will send to the root system to say, hey, I'm here, I need to be fed, will get lost. And so you'll get basically a blank pod where the seeds are formed, but they just won't grow. And that's because the plant has said, no, we're not done. So to me, it's going at 3 weeks after the big heats. You start to look, or after you've had some significant cooler weather in that period, that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on in my mind.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things we touched on, and Doug, it was before you jumped on, was that it's a communication issue when pollination doesn't happen. So we've got, so we've got some hormones at play, some communication not happening, and it just feels a little personal, I'll be honest, a little close to home on this one. But fascinating though to think that the plant basically has to signal to say, I have seeds here, we need to fill them, but the plant says, no, we don't have the capacity to fill those seeds.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's
okay.
what typically you also see on a canola plant. As you go higher up on the main raceme and you get into farther out branches, you'll actually see that the pods become shorter with less seed, because the plant first priority. So how canola works is that when the very first pod is formed, it says, I'm number one, I need to be fed first. And then the second pod comes in, and there's basically a lineup. It's like going to a smorgasbord, And so you'll see that some of they just say, no, we're done, and we only have so much nutrients. And this is where we got talking about macros and boron. Well, you can put all the boron in the world you want, but if you're short of sulfur is not mobile in the plant. It's still having to be uptaken from the ground. And what a lot of people don't realize is that canola is still absorbing about 0.5 pound a day, even at late pod fill per acre. So if you're short, it's not making seed size, and it's not filling seed, and it's just doing things like that. So it's an interesting little system, the canola plant, as much as it's a weed. So.
It is a bit of a weed. So, Steph, we haven't mentioned my least favorite crop, soybeans, but I suppose we shall in here. We know that soybeans love August rain to fill. Mm-hmm. Do we worry on the pollination side, or because they flower and have such a long window that they can potentially be producing those pods, or do we worry less? Where are we at with soybeans? Because I have to ask.
I feel like they're the cousin that nobody likes. Like they, but they're like always there, and they're around.
They're family. We have to invite them.
They're family, and they're in there. But no, I mean, they have such a wide flowering window. So I know Horst has done all that work where he's thrown everything at them. And you think, how we look at these other crops, like Pete said, the canolas, the brassicas, and you try to manage that flowering window, and then the untreated check yields more than the kitchen sink. So treatments. So, we tend to just start to neglect that because the soybeans just do whatever they want anyways. Circling back to that haze conversation, we did have, I think we did have some impact on soybean seed set last year. The biggest conversation we had, the bean crop looked great, and then at harvest time, a lot of those top pods, kind of what Doug mentioned about the canola, a lot of our top pods, the seed didn't set in it. We had two bean pods when there were 3 bean, 4 bean pods potential. So we had that impact on the crop. That would have been probably after that pollination window. But right now in our area, we had basically everybody's planting beans at the same time as corn now, right? So they're pollinating, they're trying to flower, they're beginning to flower, and in before the July 1st weekend. We have a really long flowering window on there. We see the same thing at times. Those beans will they'll reflower. We're starting to see that in some of these varieties. They'll start to reflower at even this stage of the game, and they'll say, let's keep going. But it never really seems to shake out at the end of the day. The difference between the 40 bushel beans, the 70 bushel beans, like it, that August rain seems to trump. Now, not too much rain. We don't need duck ponds, but that August rain seems to trump anything pollination related. Just feeding those beans that are there, definitely. So,
Doug, does it make you feel better about being a canola expert? Or do you really want to add soybeans to your mix? Because I'm going to say no.
I'm not an expert, number one, just an experienced gray bearded guy, sort of like Ray DeBanco.
Yeah, he's here too.
Yeah, but actually, I wouldn't mind adding soybeans to the equation out here because it would sure help with some chemistry and disease rotation. But our biggest problem is that traditionally our Augusts are so dry. That's what we need, that moisture. We don't get it. And that's the main reason too is why winter canola will not work. Because number one, we don't get the germination, but we don't get the vernalization here before winter, and then of course the spring frost. So, I think the ideal world would be to find a canola that can basically live in an ice box, so we could start in March. I think.
Well, let's work on it, right?
Yeah.
Isn't there like natural antifreeze? We can.
Yeah.
We'll just put that into the plants and away we go. Right, Steph?
There we go.
Well, that's always the hard part, right? Like you want, like the winter wheat crop in Ontario heads out, early June. This year it was May, and so we want it cool and nice during that week. We're not too picky. But we want it hot for the corn crop. And then, so just both. And then, when the corn's tasseling, we just want it cool as well. So we just want Mother Nature to give us exactly what we ordered. Yeah.
Yeah. We're probably not going to get it. I'll be honest.
So
we should maybe park that one because I don't think we're gonna get it. All right, we are out of time. Ray, Doug, you've got him into the chat again. Back to dormant seeding canola. Doug, does that bring back nightmares or fond memories?
It brings up many nightmares.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds right.
We've played with it. It was done many years ago here in Alberta. The problem is that seeding for dormant seeding canolas, it's got to be done basically the last couple of days before freeze up. And then you really got to hope like heck is that the snow stays on there till April, and then it runs off, and then you have some good weather after. Guys played with it for about 2-3 years in a row, and they managed maybe 1 to 2 plants per square foot after all that dormant seeding. And that just doesn't make a canola crop. It just makes a weed mess. So
it's a weed. Yeah, it's a weed.
I think we need to find something that gives us that early season frost protection so that we can go in on May 1st or April 15th and not worry about -2 for a couple hours.
Yeah. Okay. I like it. That is what I remembered as well. So I'm glad it was fresher in your nightmares than mine. All right. So thank you to Peter Johnson, who has moved on. Still in the chat, though. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Doug and Steph. This has been a lot of fun. And yes, birds and the bees, Steph. You did it. You covered all the bases. It's very important. All right. Join us, of course, next week, 8 p.m. Eastern. We're back in the swing of things. Going to round out this growing season. If you've got any ideas, send them my way for topics you want us to cover. Always looking for new ideas. But thank you all for joining us. And check out realagriculture.com/agronomists to get those CEU credits. Thank you to our show sponsors. And we shall see you next week. Bye, everybody.